The ditch was 26 feet deep. Not a trench, not a crater. A dry brick-sided drop cut around a hilltop fortress, wide enough to swallow men and steep enough to trap them at the bottom. Above it, German firing slits looked down like black teeth, and on February 18, 1945, Soviet infantry reached that edge and learned the ugly truth. Hitler had not left them a city. He had left them a stone machine. Poznan, then called Posen by the Germans, had been declared a fortress behind the Soviet lines. Its job was simple on paper: stand in the path of the Red Army, force the Soviets to stop, bleed them for every street, and slow the road to Berlin. But the men outside those walls were not ordinary attackers. They were Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, the army that had survived Stalingrad, the army that knew what walls became when enough men learned how to break them. This is the story of how a Prussian fortress city, protected by 18 outer forts, a hilltop citadel, deep ditches, redoubts, tunnels, brick casemates, and a last-man order from Hitler himself, was taken apart in one brutal month. Not by courage alone, not by numbers alone, but by method. Start with the map. January 1945. The Eastern Front is no longer a line. It is a door being kicked open. The Red Army launches the Vistula Oder offensive from bridgeheads it had been feeding for months. Fuel, shells, bridging gear, men, tanks, all packed into the frozen East Bank until the waiting ended. Then the guns opened. The German front west of the Vistula did not bend slowly. In many places, it cracked before the infantry even reached it. Soviet tank armies drove west through snow and wrecked columns, covering distances that made German staff maps obsolete by nightfall. Road junctions vanished. Rail lines were cut. Units that had been on the front in the morning were suddenly in the Soviet rear by evening. And in the middle of that rush stood Poznan. The city mattered because the routes mattered. Roads and rail lines from Warsaw toward Germany knotted there. For an army racing to the Oder, Poznan was not just a city on the map. It was a hinge in the road to Berlin. Hitler looked at that hinge and ordered it locked. He declared Poznan a Festung, a fortress. That word sounded powerful. It sounded like discipline. It sounded like steel. But in 1945, a Festung order usually meant something colder. It meant no retreat. It meant being surrounded on purpose. It meant the front would move on without you, while headquarters pretended your sacrifice was a strategy. The theory was that fortress cities left behind the Soviet advance would become stones in the flood. The Red Army would have to stop at each one, spend weeks reducing them, and lose the momentum that was carrying it toward Germany. There was only one problem. The Soviet spearheads did not stop. They moved around Poznan and kept going. The tanks did not batter the gate. They bypassed the gate. The flood did not argue with the rock. It went around it, and that left the city sealed off behind Soviet lines, waiting for the infantry army coming up behind. That army belonged to Vasily Chuikov. Inside Poznan, the German defenders had the kind of strength that looks impressive in a report and fragile in a burning room. There were regular Wehrmacht troops. There were officer cadets pulled into the fight before they had become officers. There were police units, Luftwaffe ground personnel with no airfields left to serve, fortress artillerymen, local Volkssturm, old men and boys dressed up as a final line. The numbers are still messy, because by then the German system itself was messy. Estimates range from 15,000 to many times that. What matters is that the garrison was not a fresh field army, but it had something more dangerous than freshness. It had the ground. The Prussians had built Poznan as a ring fortress in the 19th century. Around the city stood 18 outer forts, spaced so that one could help protect the next. Each fort was a buried monster of brick, earth, ditch, and firing port. From a distance, many looked less like buildings than low hills, because the killing rooms were hidden under earth. That was the design. Make the fort hard to see. Make the approach easy to sweep. Make the attacker step into a web, where every fort protected the flanks of the other forts. A man attacking one wall could be shot from the side by another. A gun trying to silence one embrasure could be answered by the next one over. The whole ring was not a row of isolated forts. It was a system, and at the north of the city, on a hill above the streets, stood the heart of that system, Fort Winiary, the Citadel. Its dry ditch was roughly 33 feet across and 26 feet deep. Its brick faces were too steep to climb. Its redoubts could fire down into the ditch. Its inner works held chambers, tunnels, shelters, firing positions, and brick spaces where men could vanish from shell fire and reappear at the ports. A fortress like that does not have to move. It waits. It forces the attacker to become visible. It turns every approach into a question. How do you cross the ditch? How do you reach the door? How do you kill a firing slit that only has to be open wide enough for a machine gun? That was the geometry Hitler trusted. Chuikov trusted something else. He trusted men who had learned in Stalingrad that a city is not conquered in lines on a map. It is conquered in rooms, stairwells, cellars, holes through walls, and seconds of violence at arm's length. At Stalingrad, his 62nd Army had lived inside rubble. It had fought the Germans from apartment blocks, factories, ruins, drainage ditches, and smashed masonry. It had learned to stay close enough to the enemy that German firepower became dangerous to Germans too. Now that army had a new name, the 8th Guards, and the lesson was reversed. At Stalingrad, Chuikov's men had defended ruins. At Poznan, they would manufacture them. The assault began in late January. The first proof that the fortress was mortal came almost immediately. On January 26th, Soviet Guards divisions took 2 forts on the southern edge. That sounds small until you understand the design. The ring was supposed to protect itself. Every fort depended on the others staying alive. Once the southern teeth were knocked out, the Soviets could push into the city and begin working the fortress from angles the Prussian engineers had never wanted an enemy to have. The forts were strongest facing outward. Their backs were not built for an attacker already inside the city. That was the first crack in the legend of an impregnable fortress, not the collapse of a wall, the collapse of a design assumption. The Germans had prepared to stop an enemy coming from outside the ring. Chuikov made the ring fight enemies on both sides of itself, and then he broke it into pieces. The Red Army did not solve Poznan with one giant charge. It solved it with small teams carrying the right tools. Storm groups, assault groups, a handful of submachine gunners, sappers with explosive charges, flamethrower teams, riflemen, machine gunners, and direct fire weapons close enough to hit what they could see. Each group had a job. The submachine gunners kept defenders down. The sappers crawled or rushed forward with satchel charges. The flamethrower operators dealt with rooms bullets could not clean out. The guns broke holes. The infantry went through them. There was no romance in it, no clean parade of bravery, just a practiced system for killing a building. The key was direct fire. The old forts had been designed to absorb artillery that fell from a distance. Shells coming in high, blasts landing on earth cover. Pressure spread across ramparts built by men who understood 19th century cannon. Chuikov's gunners changed the argument. They dragged guns forward and fired straight into doors, embrasures, and walls, over open sights, across streets, at the range where the gun crew could see the brick they were about to break. A fortress designed to endure bombardment from the sky is a different thing when a heavy shell punches horizontally into its face. A firing slit becomes a target. A door becomes a wound. A corridor becomes a trap. The wall still has mass, but the attacker is no longer debating the wall as a whole. He is choosing the one brick mouth that matters and feeding it explosives. Imagine one of those forts during the reduction. Soviet infantry works close through ruined streets and courtyards. German machine guns snap from ports cut into brick. A self-propelled gun edges forward, its crew exposed long enough to aim. It fires. The entrance disappears in dust. Sappers run in while the defenders are still blind. A charge goes against a door. Another charge goes against a firing position. The blast throws smoke through the chamber. A flamethrower tongue enters through a slit, and the air inside becomes punishment. Men who had trusted stone suddenly discover that stone can hold heat and smoke, as well as it holds safety. Some positions were not destroyed at first. They were blinded. Soviet soldiers jammed rubble, debris, and broken masonry into firing ports. It was crude, almost primitive, but a gun that cannot see the ditch or the street cannot control it. That was Poznan in miniature. Modern war, industrial weapons, and then a man with broken brick in his hands, forcing a machine gun to go blind. Fort by fort, the ring lost its voice. By February 12th, most of the city was in Soviet hands. The German garrison had been squeezed out of streets, outer forts, and strongpoints until the fight contracted around the hill. Fort Winiary, the Citadel, the last hard knot. Inside, command had already become a sign of the fortress's sickness. The original commander, General Major Ernst Mattern, had been removed early in the battle. He was replaced by General Major Ernst Gonel, a fanatical Nazi who treated the last man order not as a military burden, but as a creed. Under Gonel, surrender was not simply forbidden, it was dishonor. Retreat was weakness. The garrison was trapped between Chuikov outside and ideology inside. That is one of the cruel things about fortress orders. They pretend to give men something solid to hold. Often they only remove the last sane way out. By mid-February, the defenders had no realistic hope of relief. The Soviet spearheads were already far west. The city was not delaying the war in the way Hitler imagined. It was being consumed while the war moved around it. And still the Citadel waited. When the final assault began on February 18th, the Soviets reached the ditch and found that every lesson of modern urban combat had been pulled back into something ancient. The tanks could not simply roll over. The infantry could not simply rush through. The far wall rose steep and brick-faced. The redoubts above it swept the bottom with fire. So the attackers brought ladders. Ladders. In 1945, in the war of rockets, tanks, self-propelled guns, and entire cities turned to dust, Soviet infantry climbed into a fortress ditch with scaling ladders like soldiers in a medieval siege, and the Citadel punished them for it. Men dropped into the ditch and were caught in the open. The first attempts were thrown back. The geometry was working. For a moment, the old fortress forced the new war to obey its rules. But that was never Chuikov's strength. He did not win by obeying the enemy's rules for long. He won by identifying which part of the rule could be broken. The redoubts had to die, one by one, not as a symbol, as a mechanical problem. If the redoubt could still see the ditch remained a killing ground. If the redoubt went blind, the ditch became bridgeable. So the Soviets burned, blasted, and blocked them. Flamethrowers and explosives silenced one. Rubble and debris blocked the line of fire of another. Infantry who could not destroy a position fast enough denied it vision. For nearly 3 days, the fight was measured in yards and firing ports. Not in cities, not in armies, yards, ports, corners, angles. The kind of battle where one opening in a wall decides whether 50 men can move. Then the engineers came forward. They built an assault bridge across the dry moat under fire. This was not a neat construction job behind the lines. It was combat engineering in a place designed to kill engineers. Every board, span, support, and movement had to be made under the eyes of men still trying to hold the hill. But by early February 22nd, the bridge was strong enough. Red Army tanks and assault guns crossed into the Citadel grounds. That was the moment the fortress stopped being a fortress. Not when every room had fallen, not when every defender had quit, but when Soviet armor stood on the hill the Germans had believed protected them. The ditch had not been conquered by bravery alone. It had been made irrelevant by engineering. The wall had not been argued with. It had been bypassed, blinded, bridged, and entered. Inside the citadel, Gonal finally allowed surviving men to attempt escape. Too late. The order that had refused retreat for weeks became permission after escape had ceased to exist. Gonal did not surrender. He killed himself. Command fell back to Mattern, the man removed earlier for not being hard enough. And with the citadel broken, Mattern made the decision Gonal could not make. He surrendered the remaining defenders. Roughly 12,000 men laid down arms at the end. More than 17,000 prisoners would be taken in the wider battle. By February 23rd, the fortress city was cleared. Poznan had lasted about 1 month. The cost was severe. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed taking the city. Polish troops fighting alongside them also died in the assault. German dead filled cemeteries. Civilians inherited the ruins. More than half of Poznan was severely damaged, and the old center suffered terribly. That is the hidden truth inside the word fortress. It sounds like protection. But once a city is ordered to become a fortress, its streets become trenches, its houses become firing positions, and its people inherit the rubble of somebody else's command. Hitler wanted Poznan to stop an army. It did not stop the army. It became a lesson for the army that came behind. Because the battle was not really a contest between stone and flesh. Stone had the first advantage. Stone had height. Stone had mass. Stone had ditches, ports, tunnels, and the memory of an older century. But Chuikov's men had the one thing stone does not have: adaptation. They did not attack the idea of the fortress. They attacked its functions. If a fort depended on flanking fire, they broke the flank. If a firing slit controlled a street, they blinded the slit. If a door would not open, they blew another entrance. If a ditch could not be climbed, they bridged it. If a room could not be cleared by bullets, they sent fire into the air it needed to breathe. This is why Poznan matters. Not because it was the biggest battle of 1945. Not because it changed the war by itself, but because it exposed the failure at the heart of Hitler's fortress thinking. A wall is not a strategy. A last-man order is not a plan. And an old system of defense is only terrifying until it meets men who understand exactly which part of it has to fail first. The Prussians had built Poznan to make an attacker pay for every approach. Hitler used it to make his own soldiers pay for every illusion. Chuikov reduced it the only way a fortress like that can be reduced, not by believing in momentum, by giving momentum tools. The wall had height. The men outside had method. Method 1.